how often the Krell technicians have ridden in this little vehicle. But now, Dr. Morbius, prepare your minds for a new scale of physical scientific values, gentlemen.
Hello, and welcome to every single sci-fi film ever. I'm Aisha Khan. Today we'll be talking about the 1956 film Forbidden Planet, which is very often considered one of the greatest and most influential science fiction films of all time. It was directed by Fred Wilcox and produced by Nicholas Nayfack. Screenwriter Cyril Hume changed the story he was given, which was based on Mercury and was called Fatal Planet. But the core of the story is loosely based on Shakespeare's Tempest. Quite often I do an overview of the films that were successful the year prior, but since I did that last episode, I've decided to just have a quick overview of the big events that happened in 1956 in the USA to get a feel for what was happening. So 1956 was the year that Grace Kelly married the Prince of Monaco, and Marilyn Monroe married Arthur Miller the writer, who was called in front of the House of Un-American Activities Committee and asked about whether he knew any communist writers. When he refused to answer the questions, he was held in contempt of Congress. This was also the year that the murderers of Emmett Till confessed in a magazine to the murder of the teenage boy, but there were no repercussions because they had been acquitted the year prior. Also in 1956, Santa Cruz in California banned all public playing of rock and roll. And it was also the year that Elvis Presley made his debut on the Ed Sullivan Show. So with that, on to our wonderful guests. Jay Talott is Professor Emeritus of Film and Media Studies at Georgia Tech. He has written/edited numerous amounts of books and articles about science fiction and film, including the 2023 released Selling Science Fiction Cinema. Welcome back to the show, Jay. How are you?
I'm doing just fine.
Great. Joining Jay is Glyn Morgan, who's curatorial lead at the Science Museum in London and a science fiction scholar. Welcome back to the show, Glyn. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thanks for having me again.
Wonderful. I wanted to just get started on why this film makes such a big impression on connoisseurs of science fiction. Like almost everyone I've spoken to and a lot of the reading that I've done even before we got to this film tends to mention this film as a huge deal in the science fiction history of cinema.
I think that partly there's a sense of it being important in the time and us kind of respecting that. But I guess maybe it's the first science fiction film that people feel they can be unabashedly proud of, because it's the first science fiction film that isn't a B movie that's maybe performing above expectation. You know, like you've looked at some fantastic films in this podcast, and they're great, but they're great in spite of being, you know, black and white, low budget. Like you know, they rise above the constraints that have been put on them by the studio or whatever. Whereas this is the first big science fiction film. It's the first film that has a big studio who are just throwing everything at it, and indeed a production team who are throwing things the studio didn't even know they were throwing at it. So it's widescreen, it's in color, it's, you know, it's got all the MGM magic of the Wizard of Oz and Singing in the Rain, except that it's a science fiction film, and it's not trying to be, you know, funny or, you know, campy or anything like that. It plays it straight. It's intelligent. It's got amazing effects. You know, I think it's, for me, it's the science fiction film from which I see all the other science fiction films I love have like a lineage, and that's why I love it.
Excellent. And Jay, you're quite fond of this film. Can you tell us a bit about why?
Well, I'm fond of it. My students have seldom been that fond of it, and it probably is for the same reasons that Glenn has already mentioned, and that is there's so much that it contributes to the whole history of science fiction that by the time they see this, they say, "Oh, well, there's nothing new there," but there was everything new there then. Uh, it simply was a sort of a groundbreaking film. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's the first self-respecting science fiction film. Certainly, we can go back in the history to films like Metropolis,
Sure.
or even MGM spending far too much money, which they tended to do on lots of films, with Mysterious Island in 1929,
Yeah.
which was an enormous disaster. A hurricane hit during the filming of that movie. But they spent an enormous amount of money on it, all their stars, etc. Yeah, they sort of learned a lesson there. But again, even in the 1950s, you have earlier science fiction films like Day the Earth Stood Still, and you already know that one of my favorite films of that period is the Howard Hawks' The Thing.
Mine too.
Which, yeah, all right, well, very good. You have great taste.
Thank you.
This is a film that it addresses multiple audiences. There's something for everyone in here. It offers big ideas. It asks you to engage with big ideas, pure instrumentality, that creation by thought. It works within the classical context of the utopian dystopian story, and that is, here is a civilization that has reached its ultimate, but that is also its downfall. The utopian and the dystopian built in together. It is really taking on the ultimate science fiction question: what if? And I think this is one of its subtler but more important accomplishments. It really marks the convergence of mechanical and computer technology. This is a world in which you have Robby the Robot, who is both a mechanical figure and a computer figure.
Welcome to Altair 4, gentlemen. I am to transport you to the residence. If you do not speak English, I am at your disposal with 187 other languages along with their various dialects and subtongues.
Colloquial English will do fine, thank you.
Even though it is a space opera, it is also an uncanny space opera, which is a very unusual thing. And that is, space operas usually are about going out into space, adventuring on a grand scale. We have that here. But this is also about the human mind. And that is the uncanny spot. It is going into the self, not just away from the self, not just leaving humanity and its earthly home, but delving into humanity and what its ultimate home is.
Absolutely. And can we go into a bit more about the making of the film? Like, MGM is such a high-end studio. What made them decide to do a science fiction at this time?
Why would MGM make a film like this? It is, after all, the studio whose motto is Ars Gratia Artis, art for art's sake. And we think of all the things that are on television in this period. Science fiction in 1956 on television is Space Patrol and Tom Corbett's Space Cadet, things of that ilk. In the movies, it is apocalyptic narratives. That is earthly invasion, for example, or the sudden incursion of the Japanese kaiju films.
Yeah.
Monster films, again, destroying the earth.
And that's quite interesting as well, that most of the films that we have covered do tend to reflect society of the time. And I feel like this is more, as you said, it's more inward looking and also kind of forward looking in a way that it's not dealing with those issues of the Red Scare or of nuclear disaster and stuff like that.
Well, of course, we do wind up with a kind of nuclear disaster at the end. MGM takes a gamble here, and they're taking a gamble because several of those big science fiction films, I shouldn't say big, several of those
prominent,
well-known science fiction films of that period have been making a lot of money, and they've been making a lot of money without spending a lot of money. MGM is in that transitional period. They've kicked out Louis B. Mayer, who for over 30 years had made this one of the probably the prestige studio in the world, and then he hit upon a bad period, and the Supreme Court Paramount decision had forced the studios to divest themselves of their theatrical holdings, and so the Lowe's, which is the parent company, the Lowe's hierarchy fired Louis B. Mayer, and they put in Dory Sherry. And Dory Sherry indicated that they were going to do. And here's the quote that he offered: more timely and less costly films. And so this was going to be a less costly film. This was a film that was budgeted originally at, I think, $900,000, which put it under the A category at MGM. It was in a B category originally.
Glyn, can we talk about maybe some of the things that budget was spent on that caused it to almost double there, I think, Jay?
Easily double.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know how much specifically things cost, but you can see the money on the screen in a lot of ways. You know, that the absolutely it's all filmed on a soundstage on a
Incidentally, the same soundstage as Wizard of Oz, by the way.
Oh, there you go, the MGM stage. And, you know, just like Wizard of Oz, they've got these massive matte paintings to kind of extend the landscape and the background. You know, these are huge. But there's also you know, unusual for a science fiction film, a wide variety of them. It's not one or two sets. There's loads, and some of them aren't even used that much. You know, there's some of the underground city ones, which are, in my opinion, the best ones. They're absolutely spectacular, and the
That
use
sense
of
of scale
the
is
depth
just,
tricks, the depth perception tricks in the camera, in camera special effects, I think are amazing, and must have been even more so to a viewer in the 50s. You know, all of that kind of production, plus, you know, large props and sets like this, the flying saucer and things like that. But then, of course, there's Robby, which we'll come to, who is, you know, a hugely sophisticated science fiction costume or prop, depending how you
So
want to.
Robby apparently cost $125,000, which is such a large amount of money for a robot.
Billed as the most expensive prop on any MGM film ever.
Wow. Yeah.
And still the most valuable. So he, the original Robby was auctioned in the last few years, and sold for a record price. And depending how you class props and costumes, is one of the most expensive for pieces of film memorabilia ever sold, up there with like Marilyn Monroe's famous white dress and like one of the Bond cars. You know, it's like hugely iconic. And what I love about Robby in this film as well is that he gets billing. So it's, you know, the actors have their actual names, and then it's introducing Robby the Robot, which is fitting because I guess in an attempt to get some value for money, MGM use Robby again. So Robby is almost a character because he appears in other science fiction films and TV series in these kind of cameo roles or recast as a different character. Is it the Invisible Boy? That he kind of like reappears in. Yeah.
Jay, I feel like you have a really strong affinity for Robby, and when I spoke to you, it looks like your eyes light up when you speak about him. So I'm going to let you do a bit more of that. Why is Robby so different from all the robots that came before him?
You know, I've written a book just on this, so I could go on for hours here, and I'll try not to. You know, as Glenn said, this is a character in itself that has persisted. I want to say almost a half century. In fact, if you trace out his appearance in other films, it's not only The Invisible Boy, but Hollywood Boulevard, Cherry 2000, Gremlins in the 1980s, even Tomorrowland from 2015. You know, he's still around, and he's been in television forever and ever. You know, once you have these costumes, and I do tend to think of it as a costume because it was something that someone put on, just like the Gillman costume in Creature from the Black Lagoon. Once you have these things and they resonate with the public, they tend to hang around and they get reused and reused and reused. this is the robot that marks the transition in the world of robot cinema. From the earliest days of the cinema, we have these clanking metal stovepipe-looking robots, and with the only exception being famous Maria of Metropolis.
It's more of an android, but yeah.
Yeah. But the artificial figure in the movies is the same all the way from 1920s through the 1950s. In fact, the last appearance of one of those clanking metal stovepipe robots, as I keep describing them, occurs in a serial in just about this period, 1954 to 1955. It's the Captain Video movie serial. And they used the exact same robot costumes that were used over 20 years ago.
And would it be fair to say that this is like the first robot with a personality, and we're going towards the kind of AI concept of robots, or have we seen earlier iterations of that?
Yeah, no, this is, like I said, this is the changing point, because this is a robot that is not simply a remotely controlled or button controlled clanking metal mechanical figure. This is a robot with a brain, with positronic circuits, and positronic is one of those terms that you see used back in the late 30s and 40s by Isaac Asimov, and who's absolutely important, and crucial for a film like this and for Robby the Robot. But Robby is a self-controlled and therefore potentially dangerous robot, and that is always the sort of issue with him in later versions, later appearances. It's even the point that is made when MGM starts publicizing this figure. They put him on two of their own TV shows, the MGM Parade television shows, and he is presented as possibly dangerous, possibly having a mind of his own. There's this one scene in the second MGM Parade show where Walter Pidgeon is talking about him, and then we see Robby off in a dark corner all by himself, and you hear this sort of fiendish laugh, as if he were plotting. And indeed, he winds up playing a bad robot in other films, and including the famous TV show in the later 60s, Lost in Space. They have a robot that was also designed by Robert Kinoshita, who designed Robby. And that robot is the good robot, and he is then opposed by Robby the Robot, who appears in several. I think it's in 2 episodes.
And they're quite similar
Robby
looking.
has to play the bad guy.
Yeah.
But again, it's that fundamental shift to a robot with a mind that becomes the key for them doing that next film, Invisible Boy, because the villain in the Invisible Boy is a mainframe computer.
I wanted to just touch upon Asimov, because this is one of the first kind of introductions of the 3 laws of robotics into cinema. Glyn, do you happen to know them off the top of your head? You tend to know things like that.
No, I do. I'm really bad at remembering that sort of thing, but
I'm going to have to revoke your geek card right now.
I know that I could guess
the general
on the
gist of it,
but I'll get them wrong. But it's the fact that he can't do any harm to humans, cannot through inaction cause harm to be done, and then something about self-preservation. Unless that comes into conflict with either of the other 2 laws. Yes. There you go. Got there eventually.
And we'll put those in the show notes. But that's obviously demonstrated quite early on in the film. And those laws are familiar probably to science fiction readers at this point, because they're from 1942. But this is kind of the first time they kind of demonstrate that, look, we can have safe robots because they follow these 3 laws.
Aim right between the eyes. Fire. You see? He's helpless, locked in a sub-electronic dilemma between my direct orders and his basic inhibitions against harming rational beings. Cancelled.
And there's a fourth law.
Oh, I didn't know there was a
There's
fourth law.
Isaac Asimov called it his Zeroth law, and that was ultimately a robot must protect humanity, not individual humans, but humanity itself.
Very interesting. And also, it could be scary because you suggested that he could harm individuals for the greater good, which is where a lot of these science fiction films end up going anyway.
I think what Jay was saying about how he's presented as in some of the supporting material as a threat, you see that in the poster where he's mimicking the classic B-movie monster pose of carrying the actress away as if he's kidnapping her.
And as one commentator said, it's as if he has sex on his positronic circuits, sex in mind in his positronic circuits. But none of those images correspond to the films in which they appear.
No.
They've baited people in with the poster.
Yeah, bait and switch. I also love that there are these MGM publicity stills of Anne Francis and Robby that were taken. They're these black and white glamour shots, on a completely blank stage, and she's in like refined gear, and it's like he's the butler, kind of like helping her along. Yes. There's one where he's putting a shoe on her as well, and like they're just these completely charming publicity stills.
And one where he's helping her with her makeup.
There you go. Yeah.
I also wanted to mention, you talked about mainframes, Jay, that this is the time IBM is making huge mainframe computers, and the term artificial intelligence was also coined in 1956. So that was at Dartmouth College. So I just sort of mentioned that. I just wanted to go back to the special effects slightly because, okay, Robby looks amazing, but so do these special effects. Like, even compared to stuff today, when I see that flying saucer going through space, it's really convincing. I mean, you can't believe that it's how old? Like almost 70 years old. It's a phenomenal look and feel. And it does have really rich colours. And you can tell MGM have kind of, they wanted it within the line of those kind of Wizard of Oz kind of films where it's, stunning visually.
Yeah. Well, like the first words out of someone's lips when they land on the planet are like,
"Look at the color of that sky."
Yeah, but I'll still take blue.
I don't know. I think a man could get used to this. Grow to love it.
Which is just underlining this is a Technicolor experience.
Fortunately, we have the ship's cook who helps undercut some of this. What was it? The doctor says, "Look at that beautiful world," and then the cook says, "Another one of them beautiful worlds. No women, no beer, and no pool halls."
Yeah, and he says all you could do is throw rocks at tin cans, and you have to bring your own tin cans. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, he's not happy to be there. I just wanted to talk about Altaira, who is the daughter of Dr. Morbius in the film, and she is young and stunningly beautiful, and she wears quite scandalously a miniskirt. I actually was talking to someone on my Instagram, and they started watching the film, and I had to stop because they were like, it's actually really sexist, because when these men who've been traveling, who are from the future, but really they're not, they're from 1956, who have been traveling, many, many light years to get to this planet, they all kind of drool and leer over this completely innocent, beautiful, young, confident woman.
Of course, you must make allowances for my daughter, gentlemen. She's never known any human being except her father.
I hope you'll make allowances too, sir. We young men have been shut up in hyperspace for well over a year now, and right from here, the view looks just like heaven.
Apparently, the miniskirt was so scandalous in Spain that the film was banned until almost 10 years later in 1967. So any thoughts on the kind of gender dynamics of this film? Because I have a few thoughts, but I'll let you guys go first.
I'll just make a brief comment or two about the costuming. Certainly, they wanted to figure out how can you intrude something for everyone here, and is there anything at all to get women into the theater? And recruiting Helen Rose to do the costuming for Altaira was a major move because she had already won 2 Academy Awards, including the previous year for Best Costume Design, and she was already at work on the wedding dress for Princess Grace of Monaco. The wedding is the same year as this film, so costuming had to knock it out of the park, if you will. One of the more interesting things I ever read about science fiction, and I don't remember who said this, but they said, imagining the future is not that difficult. Doing what's the technology going to look like? We extrapolate from what we have. Imagining the art and the creativity of the future is nigh impossible. And I think that is the obstacle, the challenge that Helen Rose and the makers of this film were dealing with, and that is, let's just go all the way out there and see what we come up with. And unfortunately, that can mean you offend some people.
But it is quite forward-looking because the miniskirt's going to become quite ubiquitous in in the next decade. But it is quite shocking because this is the mid-50s. It's not even 58 or 59 that it was so forward-thinking.
The bikini was making waves and scandalizing people in the United States in the 1950s already. So they were talking about these things, but you weren't supposed to be looking at them.
Yeah.
Well, and of course, this is the other thing we should keep in mind. This is exactly the point, maybe a year or so earlier, 2 years earlier, when the production code essentially loses its teeth in the United States. This dress, if it appeared in the miniskirts that she wears, if she were to wear those in 1953 or 54, it probably wouldn't. The film probably would not have gotten a certificate.
And the nude suit as well, because she swims
naked. The nude suit as well.
Yeah.
But because of certain other films that appeared, for example, The Moon is Blue, which is about a year or so before this, the production code has pretty much backed off. It's not being taken as seriously anymore. So you do feel a little more comfortable about pushing the envelope. And they do it with costuming. But they're doing it with other art in that film as well. And Glenn, you mentioned the auctioning off of the Robby the Robot. The other thing that was auctioned off just in the last year or so, they found the fish sculpture from the that's right outside of Professor Morbius's house, that metal fish sculpture, and that was just auctioned off for an enormous amount. And it does indeed look like something out of space.
As much as I think a lot of the film stands up and I still very much enjoy watching it, as a modern viewer, the two parts that I struggle with the most are, first of all, taking Leslie Nielsen seriously as a romantic lead, because I just can't watch
There's a
him
certain
without
generation of us who can't take him seriously at all.
He's Naked Gun and Airplane, and there's all these other roles of his that are more famous in my mind and more embedded before I'd ever seen this film. So I really struggle with that. But putting that aside, I think the way that Anne Francis's Altaira, the way that role goes, I mean, to a certain extent, it's in the source material. This is an adaptation of Shakespeare, and Miranda in The Tempest gets a very similar sort of treatment. So there's that. But yeah, if you're watching it now, you see that the crew are gaslighting her and are manipulating her into stealing kisses, and she's talked about as if she's not in the room even when she is, when they're discussing like, oh, she'll have to go off to Earth soon, and all this kind of stuff. But I think one of the things that saves it is that Anne Francis is excellent in the role, and she plays it with a very kind of canny. She seems like she's wiser than she's written. Like, I think there's something coming through in the way that she plays it. There's like a twinkle in the eye or something that maybe makes you think that she's in on the joke as well, and she's kind of teasing them. And I think there are ways of
I think for me, what I
She
found,
studied biology, after
yeah,
all.
she does. She's bio and stops just so
Well,
that we
exactly.
know,
Yeah.
nod, nod, wink, wink. But for me, what I found really interesting is, so this is a girl who's grown into a young woman and she's had no experience of men. And that is precisely why she is so utterly comfortable around them.
This is Commander Adams, Dr. Ostro, and Lieutenant Farmer, my daughter.
How do you do?
I've always so terribly wanted to meet a young man, and now 3 of them at once.
That's very kind of you.
You're lovely, Doctor. Of course, the 2 end ones are unbelievable.
Could this end one get you some coffee?
Oh, I'm quite able to get it, thank you.
And that's really interesting because all the behaviors that are happening to her once they come here, she's not threatened by them at all, like I think most women would be. And that's what's really fascinating when they are trying to literally steal kisses.
Just once more, do you mind?
Not at all.
I don't know, Lieutenant. There must be something seriously the matter with me because honestly, I haven't noticed the least bit of stimulation.
Her reaction is so tepid that, you know, the guy's eventually offended in the end because she's just like, oh, that wasn't stimulating at all. And so it's just, that's the only thing I find somewhat acceptable because it's quite nice to see a young woman who isn't intimidated at all by these guys despite their behaviors. And it doesn't fall for their tricks to some degree as well.
Yeah. But then, you know, obviously she does ultimately end up in this slightly more damsel in distress, love interest,
Yeah.
you know, slot because, you know, that's,
It's 1956.
that is what it is. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And also that then she wants to, like, after Leslie Nielsen's been mean to her, she wants to cater to him as well, which is just like, oh, you know.
Yeah.
But yes.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, if you think about that 50s context, you know, we're forever seeing those images of the ideal woman in the kitchen, and when women encounter technology in popular culture, it's as the new device to have in your kitchen, and there's a whole discourse around like the marketing of fridges and things like that. Whereas actually in this film, she's well versed in science and literature, and Robbie is in the kitchen. You know, like Robby the Robot in a lot of ways is the 50s housewife. Like he keeps the house and he's also the dream appliance. Like he's got it all. So yeah, there's some interesting stuff going on here. I don't think you can just write it off with some far worse 1950s examples of gender.
So the monster in this is very fascinating. I mean, in the 50s, we have so many schlocky monsters, aliens, wonderful, but I like them all pretty much. But this one is very different.
My favorite monsters, especially from science fiction films, are the ones that we barely see. So I think that less is often more when it comes to monsters. And this is one of the best examples of that because it is almost entirely invisible. But then when they do finally show it, you only ever see glimpses, outlines, illuminated. It's invisible, but it's like illuminated by the radiation of the electric fences and the ray guns and things. And it's still pretty scary. You know, it's a hand-drawn animation. I think famously MGM had everything. You know, they want big studio, massive studio. They have every department you could want except an animation department. So they go down the road and borrow an animator from Disney. And there is something Disney. There's because I think he worked on Fantasia, and you can see some of the like stylistic elements to that. But it's fantastic, and you know, accompanied by the kind of sound and the use of other effects that they have, then it feels completely there and real and intimidating in a way that other monsters want, you know, to modernize, especially when you start to see the rubber and the seams and you know, these sorts of things. And then obviously conceptually, the idea of a monster from the id, this creature that is in some ways a manifestation of our worst selves.
But like you, the crowd forgot one deadly danger: their own subconscious hate and lust for destruction.
The beast, the mindless primitive. Even the Krell must have evolved from that beginning.
That is a terrifying concept for anyone, and again, very new for the science fiction cinema, and shows some of that kind of more literary influence, perhaps, on this film's conception, along with things like the three laws of robotics being included. And you mentioned we talked about this film as space opera, but in a lot of ways, that monster of the id is preempting that interest in psychology that is starting to come into science fiction and will become much bigger in the 1960s with the new wave and J.G. Ballard, advocating for an exploration of inner space instead of outer space and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Jay, do you want to add your 2 cents?
It is about the worst of ourselves, and more than that, it's about what we might not be able to control, and that plays up the larger dynamic of this film. I tend to talk about reason versus the senses here, and this is a world in which reason is becoming paramount, and that's the fear. Then is what happens when reason does become paramount, or when we keep as Mobius does, keep jacking up our intellect, our IQ with the machines. What happens to the rest of us? That's the sort of hidden monster that is being investigated in a great number of films of this period.
And we talk about how this film in some ways feels more divorced from its context than some other science fiction film, but actually the idea of technology racing ahead so fast and kind of losing control of it in a way, the Krell, the aliens who are again completely absent in this film. I love that they're kind of evoked by the architecture that they left behind, these massive structures and these big wide but quite short doors and things like that. The fact that they were this civilization clearly far more advanced than even the humans in this film, let alone humans of now or the 1950s, and yet they were destroyed by their own technology. This is 1950s, so maybe there's an atomic kind of anxiety in there as well, and maybe we see similar stories in science fiction now, worrying about global warming caused by anthropogenic climate change or AI again. So this is a recurrent theme in the genre.
Yeah, it's interesting with the Krell because I think once you maybe get familiar with the film, you forget the tensions that are building up because you don't know what this monster is and you are suspicious of Dr. Morbius. And then you're
Absolutely.
like, the Krell disappeared, or have they changed into kind of like, some other kind of beings? So it is interesting how that tension carries on. Okay, let's talk about the music, which was very, very groundbreaking for this time. Glyn.
The music and the sound effects, because I think they are one and the same in this film, which again is part of its charm. Is by Bebe and Louis Barron, and they were originally hired to do some sound effects, but MGM loved it so much that they got them to do the whole soundscape, I guess, score, and they were engineers. So this is the first film that has electronic music, and there's interviews with Bebe Barron saying that there were like 15 people making electronic music at this time. It was such a
so just to clarify,
novel...
it's the first film with purely electronic music all the way through.
Yes, of course, because I mean, with the theremin as a sound effect, for example, is already established, not least for flying saucers. But yeah, this is the first film to have it all, and I love it because it's, as someone who works at the Science Museum and is interested in the history of technology, they are innovating like on the ground, like just experimenting, finding new ways of making sound, and pushing the boundaries about what we think of as music. they originally were only hired to create something like 15 minutes of effects, and then suddenly they get turned around to do the whole film. But yeah, they were creating bespoke circuits that were, they were making whole new little devices to make these
Yeah, so this is
particular
before
sound
synthesizers and
effects.
stuff.
Yeah, exactly, and creating different tonalities and all this kind of thing. And no one had ever heard anything like it before. And I think even now it still sounds weird and new and strange, and I love it for that.
Straight
But
from the credits, like straight as soon as the credits start, you're like, okay, this is really sci-fi.
yeah, that in some ways that was also a problem because famously, because they were not musicians in the traditional sense, and certainly not members of the musicians union. This film was then ineligible for an Academy Award for Best Score because it did not, and it couldn't even be described as a score. It had to be described as
Right.
what was the phrase? Electric
Electronic
tonalities.
tonalities, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Which is just a travesty. These are people who are really pushing the boundaries of your field, but because they don't fit into your box, they're not able to be included. So, but I think they loom large in the history of electronic music and film sound effects today.
And
So their legacy is secure.
a huge legacy. And I just wanted to mention that Ben Burt, who was a sound designer who also popularized the Wilhelm scream, but he also did a whole bunch of
Mm.
films in the 70s, including Star Wars, was taken to watch this film by his father with his sister. And he said, I realized a lot of the effect of that on me was the sound of the music, meaning that Bebe's and Louis Barron's music. And then his quote was, for Star Wars, he said, I put rhythms of sound together, slowed down metallic bumping like a heartbeat inside the Death Star, which is probably in many ways because I was keying off Forbidden Planet. You couldn't escape that element to it. So yeah, it definitely has a legacy that is long-standing.
Yeah, and composers like Vangelis, who works on Blade Runner and stuff like, who is a more what we would recognize now as a more conventional electronic music composer. Like that soundtrack, iconic soundtrack, owes everything to the weirdness and uncanny elements of this film as well.
Also, one of those points at which we see the emergence of a whole new area of film production, and that is the creation of the sound designer. Um, and sound designers, we start training them in the late 1960s and 1970s. But this is the point where we're seeing it begin. Someone who comes up with new ideas and new I start to say music, but I can't say music, right? So some people who come up with new ideas for accompanying the images and amplifying the images in a variety of engineered ways. This becomes a whole different category.
Phenomenal. I just wanted to point something out because I find it really interesting, like in films like Alien and other things, where the spaceship is named after some kind of myth or some kind of reference to a book. And in this, the spaceship that goes missing that they've come to find is the Bellerophon, which is the name of an ancient Greek legend hero who was famous as a slayer of monsters, which is quite relevant to the story. And then also another one of his escapades is that he was sent on a mission to deliver a letter, but within the letter were instructions to have the messenger killed, which is also kind of relevant because Dr. Morbius is going along with these people, and then yeah. So I just thought that was interesting. But let's move on to the legacy of this film.
Well, the most obvious legacy is the Invisible Boy. There's if you have a robot sitting around in your warehouse, in your prop warehouse, and it's not doing anything, and we've invested an enormous amount of money in it, well, why can't we use it again? So let's create a film that centers around Robby the Robot. The costuming here appears everywhere. The costumes are in one of the schlockiest science fiction films of the 1950s, Queen of Outer Space, starring Zsa Zsa Gabor. She didn't fit into any of the miniskirts, but the men's costumes or the costumes for the astronauts there. the props and costuming show up in television show after television show, influencing how space travel and space garb and the whole look of the future is being presented. So, Twilight Zone, for example, you're going to see Robby and the spaceship and the costuming show up in at least 3 or 4 episodes, at least 3. The most famous is the Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, which is also one of the best episodes of television science fiction ever. There are homages everywhere as well. Star Trek, Doctor Who, Rocky Horror Picture Show. One of my favorite films, Serenity. When the crew of Serenity land on this far, far planet, they find this crashed spaceship, and it's this C-57D.
Wow, I never noticed
which
that.
is this, the designation for the ship in Forbidden Planet.
I didn't realize you were a
there
brown
are-
coat, Jay.
Yes, yeah. I've written on that film too. There's still plans for a remake. They've talked about remakes for many years, and now in December 2024, there was an announcement that there was an effort being undertaken for a new script.
But it's fine as it is.
It is
Apart from the
indeed.
sexism.
That has never stopped
no
anyone
guarantee
from
that'd
doing
go
it
away.
again. Yeah.
Glenn.
For me, as I said, there's just so much DNA from this film in the science fiction to come, and the science fiction that I love. I really enjoy how this film can be seen as both a progenitor or first step along the road for both Star Wars and Star Trek. It's you've got Robby is with his kind of like prissy butler kind of persona, and even his line where he says, I speak 187 languages and their dialogues and subtongues. Like, clearly, okay, so we're C-3PO. But the whole mission, the uniforms and everything, that's all very Star Trek as well, and it's very easy to look at Leslie Nielsen's character as a kind of proto Captain Kirk.
Absolutely, and he's a replicator as well. So
yes, replicator technology, yeah, exactly, and also just the kind of the monster from the id kind of. Star Trek would never have had the budget for an animation live action hybrid of this sort, but it's the kind of concept that Gene Roddenberry will return to, that kind of more psychological, sociological science fiction. In terms of its scale and the fidelity of its effects and its ability to create awe, it's also a good stop along the road to 2001. A Space Odyssey as well. So I do think it is just a keystone film.
I also wanted to quickly say that Altair 4 is apparently in the Star Trek universe, and it is a Federation planet. So yeah.
There you go. Well, Altair is a real star, so that's one of the things about this, is that it's also the first exoplanet that's an identifiable play destination that we could go to. So obviously long before exoplanets are proven to exist, which is only a relatively recent thing in the 90s. But yeah, it's something like the 12th brightest star in the sky or something. So
Thank you. I just wanted to say that for me, visually, I think it's just so striking for 1956. I think it feels very much looks like a 60s film, because it will influence Star Trek. And also a lot of those I don't know why, it just reminds me of like Captain Scarlet and Thunderbirds Go, like the outfits they wear and everything. They're very similar to those kind of things. And I wanted to mention that, so the set designers, Arthur Lonergan, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, and Cedric Gibbons, who designed the Oscar. It was sculpted by someone else, but he designed the Oscar. And Cedric Gibbons also holds the record for the most Oscars and nominations for production design, including Wizard of Oz, but not for Forbidden Planet, because they lost to 10 Commandments there.
Well, keep in mind that Cedric Gibbons was the head of production design at MGM, and therefore
He was
he got
taking
the
credit.
top credit
Mm.
for every one of those films with his name on it, even the ones he did not officially work or unofficially work on. Uh, so Arthur Lonigan was probably the major figure here.
Oh, thank you for telling me,
But
Joe.
yeah,
Okay, so could you recommend something for the listeners?
well, I've already recommended an episode of Twilight Zone, like The Monsters That Do on Maple Street, so that you get to see the C-57D and the aliens, in this case, wearing the outfits of Commander Adams and his crew. Uh, I'd also obviously recommend Isaac Asimov's I, Robot
Mm.
stories. If the only familiarity you have with I, Robot is that Will Smith uh, debacle of a few years back, then you probably should see what the stories were originally intended to do. And so they're all very good short. It's a collection called I, Robots, collection of short stories, and they're all very good stories. And that'll give you familiarity with the three laws of robotics and as well as the fourth law. Uh, and then, of course, I also recommend my own book on robot ecology, which places Robby the Robot and this film, of course, in a an ecological continuum of the development of the robot or artificial figure.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Glyn.
We've talked about so many different films, so I'm going to recommend maybe a couple of books. So for people maybe interested in psychology and science fiction, if they've not already delved deeply into that topic, then the most obvious place for someone to start might be the works of someone like Philip K. Dick, as accessible. So in particular, I'd go with maybe something like Ubik. So if you want to
Mm.
be tormented by elements of your own consciousness that you might not be aware of, you could try that. Or they could go for The Lave of Heaven by Ursula Le Guin, which is another great kind of psychology tormenting you by your own psychology. But if it's Voyages to Another Planet that people are after, I'll try something more recent. Try Planetfall by Emma Newman, which also has some great psychology elements to it, but is a great twist on the settlers or visitors to another world trope.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that and for coming on the show.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you.
Great. That's it for this episode. Thank you for listening. If you can leave a rating or review on your favourite podcasting app, that would be greatly appreciated. And I do love receiving them, so thank you to all of you who've already done that. Next episode, we will be covering a film I haven't quite decided yet. I have a choice of about 2 or 3, so check the show notes, because by the time this comes out, I will have decided. And apart from that, see you next time. Bye-bye.